Thank you so much, Tadeusz. I think you're one of the few persons who pronounced my last name right. Thank you for this as well. So some of you, let me just start it again. Some of you might have heard about Erfurt in the context of the research on the medieval cemetery, which started with a rescue excavation in 2013. This may be the topic of another lecture. Today, we will have a closer look at an excavation from 2007, but before I talk about any details, I will give you a short introduction and survey of the city and its Jewish quarter. Since early times, Erfurt was the central Thuringian city in economic, political, and cultural terms. The first mention was in 742 in connection with the founding of a bishopric by Boniface. Located at the crossroads of essential trading routes, the city developed into central Germany's trading hub during the course of the Middle Ages, Via Regia, and not far away, the Via Imperia. Apart from trading cloth and grain, the city mainly owed its prosperity to the trade in woad. From the late 10th century, Erfurt was under the secular rule of the Archbishop of Mainz. The first mentioning is, the first mentioning is from 742. In addition, an independent city council emerged in 1250, which aspired to more autonomy from the very beginning. As a branch of the Mainz bishops and home to numerous monasteries, Erfurt was the clerical and spiritual center of the region too. Even before the founding of the university in 1392, schools and monasterial study centers shaped the city's intellectual life. To this day, not only many medieval buildings, but also the structure of the medieval town has been preserved. This also applies to the Jewish quarter. In the last 30 years, a rich material heritage of the medieval Jewish community has been rediscovered, starting with the old synagogue in the late 1980s, a secular medieval residential building, and the Erfurt Treasure in the 1990s, and ending with a mikvah in 2007. Together with written sources, these testimonies provide a vivid portrait of Jewish life during the Middle Ages in Erfurt. In the 11th century, Erfurt became the embattled basis of the Mainz archbishop's claims to power in Thuringia. The historical documents report that in 1080, the city was captured and burned down by the troops of King Henry IV. Although there is no archaeological evidence of the complete destruction of the city, a new settlement structure seems to have been the result. During the subsequent reconstruction of the city, the first synagogue was built. You can see it on the slide. Alte Synagoge, of course, it's the old synagogue. The synagogue was erected in the late 11th century. It is the earliest evidence of a Jewish settlement, and together with the surrounding properties forms the nucleus of the medieval Jewish quarter. The first building was probably erected around 1100 as a private prayer house on the intersection of at least 3 large plots of land bordering on this side. At this time, the Jewish settlement consisted of presumably only 3 or 4 families. What the building looked like in this early period cannot be reconstructed exactly. The same applies to the second construction phase from the 12th century. It is no coincidence that this early building, as the center of the Jewish settlement, is located directly at the crossing point of the main trade routes, which was now firmly implemented here. This is where the Jewish quarter emerged. The medieval community in Erfurt possessed a synagogue, a mikveh, and probably already a cemetery as early as the 12th century. You can see it here on top of the slide, the blue here in the square. The first written source, the first written evidence of the Jewish community of Erfurt is the Erfurt Jewish Oath, which was created at the end of the 12th century. It documents existing legal context between Jews and Christians and the need to regulate them. The first Jewish families can be identified by name from around 1200. In the course of the 13th century, the Jewish settlement grew strongly, and by the middle of the 13th century, the Jewish community could also be identified as an institution. From that point in time, the community appeared in the free rents, a sort of tax list, and paid for the synagogue, the mikveh, and the cemetery. Around 1270, the community had a large representative synagogue built, incorporating older parts, and the new mikveh was built at the same time. In the same period, the image of the Jewish settlement becomes clearer. On the basis of tax lists, the owners and inhabitants of the Jewish quarter can be identified at the end of the 13th century. The Jewish quarter was located in the bend of the river Gera between Merchants Bridge, Town Hall, and St. Michael's Church. Merchants Bridge, Town Hall, and St. Michael's Church, a synagogue, and here you see the mikveh. Mainly Jews were settling in this area close to each other and their community institutions, but Christians lived in the same area too. The synagogue formed the center of the Jewish quarter. About 100 meters away on the bank of the river, the mikveh was situated. The cemetery was located as required, half a kilometer north of the Jewish quarter. The city hugely benefited from its Jewish population and their contacts all over Europe. The Jewish community continued to grow. In the first half of the 14th century, we can trace significantly more families in the Jewish quarter, and Jews and Christians lived together here in a rather peaceful coexistence. But that changed on the 21st of March of 1349. The wave of persecutions of the Jewish population correlating to the outbreak of the plague in southern Germany and spreading north from there reached Erfurt. After weeks of well-planned preparation, the Jewish community was attacked on a Shabbat when the men prayed in the synagogue and the entire community was wiped out. That caused major changes in the urban structure. The neighborhood burned down during the attack, as early chronicles already report, and the city subsequently took possession of all the property of Jews who were killed. Some plots of lands were sold on directly, and the council used former Jewish properties to build municipal facilities. Paradoxically, we owe most of the preserved medieval Jewish heritage to this catastrophe. The synagogue was converted into a warehouse, and the Erfurt Treasure was hidden. Only 5 years later, first Jewish families came to Erfurt and established the second medieval community. Jewish families moved here from other parts of Thuringia, but also from Silesia, Bohemia, and Moravia. The first families lived in houses directly behind the town hall that had been restored after the pogrom. Around here. For further immigrants, the council had rental houses built along the river Gera. You can see them here. Together with a new synagogue, also built by the council in 1370, here in the center. They formed the center of the new Jewish settlement. On the map, the blue, or in this case, the brown buildings, one of them still exists today. After repairs, the mikveh was also used by the second community. The same applies to the cemetery. The Jewish community grew rapidly, and with it, the Jewish quarter. Sorry, I was too fast. This is 1407, where you can see the density of the population. It became one of the largest in the German-speaking region and home to various wealthy moneylenders and scholars. In the early 15th century, the Jewish quarter reached its greatest extent and was larger than before the pogrom of 1349. The center of the community, however, was still in the neighborhood of the second synagogue, where there was now also a dance hall and a Jewish bakery, which will be in the center of my paper today. In the 1430s, warlike conflicts and natural catastrophes led to an economic crisis in Thuringia. From 1436 onwards, Jews were expelled from several places. Erfurt was one of the few towns where Jews could still live for a longer period of time. But in spring 1454, the Erfurt Council also declared that it no longer wished to grant protection to the Jews. This meant that legal security was lacking, and within 1 year, the last Jewish families left the town. Again, the city council took over all Jewish possessions, private and communal. But in contrast to 1349, they kept most of the institutions, houses, and properties and used them for their own purposes. The second medieval synagogue was turned into the communal armory. At the place of the former cemetery, the communal granary was erected by using many of the medieval tombstones. Tombstones were also used for extending the city's wall and many other buildings. With the migration of the last Jewish families, medieval Jewish history ended and almost completely vanished from public awareness. But the material Jewish heritage was still there, mostly hidden very well, but sometimes came to light again. When a new Jewish community was established in the 19th century, two rabbis, Theodor Kroner and Adolf Jarashevsky, investigated the history of the medieval Jewish community and both published books. They used the rich written testimonies which survived in the city's archives, text lists, chronicles, and other documents, and also the known material heritage, especially the tombstones. Both already mentioned the localization of the first medieval synagogue based on earlier research of Bernhard Hartung, published 1861. The synagogue is also described in the famous book by Richard Krautheimer in 1927. During the National Socialist period, no research on medieval Jewish history was done, and it was more or less the same during GDR times. Only Willibald Gutsche mentioned the mikveh in his article on bathhouses in medieval Erfurt in 1957, and he located it based on text lists from the 13th century, about 50 meters north of the correct place. But only in the late 20th century, the investigation of the medieval Jewish history of Erfurt started anew with a series of new or rediscoveries. Since the early 1980s, a few monument conservators and historians started to search for the medieval synagogue, based on medieval sources and older publications. And almost hidden completely, they discovered medieval walls and a part of the tracery rosette under the roof. You won't guess it from the pictures I'm showing here. And from these pictures, neither. This was a very lucky coincidence because the same colleagues took care that the building was not sold after the Wende. In 1998, the city of Erfurt purchased the building and had it renovated in a very sensitive way. At the same time, the building history was studied by Elmar Altwasser. During the examinations, it turned out that the oldest parts presumably date back to the end of the 11th and the 12th century and are thus the earliest evidence of a Jewish community in Erfurt. The main building phase can be dated around 1270, when the Jewish community erected a large and prestigious synagogue with a magnificent facade, incorporating older parts of the building. In early 14th century, the synagogue was expanded by a few meters to the north. After the pogrom of 1349, it was turned into a warehouse and later into a restaurant, you saw the pictures, and all phases of construction can still be seen in the building today. Research was completed in 2007 and published 2 years later, now housing a museum on the history of Erfurt's Jewish community in the Middle Ages. The synagogue was found an appropriate use anew. In 1998, closely nearby, on the site of Michaelisstraße 43, the Erfurt Treasure was discovered. A large hoard with a total weight of nearly 30 kilograms, until today unique in size and composition. It contained more than 3,000 silver coins, silver ingots, tableware, most beautiful pieces of jewelry, parts of belts and garment trimmings. And the most outstanding object, a golden Jewish wedding ring from the second quarter of the 14th century. All other objects are also originate from the first half of the 14th century, and some even date back to the late 13th century. The ring, as well as the find spot in the middle of the former Jewish quarter, suggests that the treasure was owned by a Jewish family. The act of its hiding can be put into context with the pogrom of March 24th, 1349. As last owner of the site before the pogrom, the Jewish banker Kalman von Wier can be identified as the original owner of the treasure. We know all this because my colleague Maria Stürzebecher wrote her PhD on the treasure, and she also worked on the historical sources, so we can tell this by sure. We can sure of this. The next lucky discovery took place in spring 2007, when the remains of the medieval mikvah were discovered during renovation works on the side wall of the river Gera. The cold bath, Frigido Balneo, was first mentioned in the Heberolle of Mainz, the tax roll from the middle of the 13th century, when the Jewish community paid annual taxes of 2 gulden for it. The excavated structure was erected in the 13th century. A preceding Romanesque building in the same spot could be identified. This is how it looks today. The archaeological excavation was concluded in 2010. After erecting a building to protect the medieval remains from external influences, the mikveh was opened to the public in 2011. Due to many other projects I have been working on, the publication I'm working on the publication, but still not finished my manuscripts. In the historic center, several medieval buildings have been preserved, which can be connected to former Jewish owners. I'm showing now a very special one. At a workshop in 2011, an important and exceptionally well-preserved medieval building could be attributed without doubt to Jews as its former owners, and even a Jewess could be identified who had built this house, a stone house in the former Judengasse. This building stands out. Numerous essential structures from the time around 1250 have been preserved, unique in the upper stories interior with a lancet, arched lighting niche, hardly changed outer walls, as well as a painted beam ceiling. The wooden ceiling is decorated with floral ornamentation and has been dendrodated to 1247. So this makes it the oldest painted ceiling north of the Alps, besides churches, of course. Today, the cellar of the stone house houses the medieval gravestones from the former Jewish cemetery. Beside all this material evidence, also many different kinds of written testimonies of the medieval Jewish community survived and are the basis for ongoing research, which I cannot address here today. For these reasons, the city of Erfurt seeks inclusion into the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites with its unique relics of the medieval Jewish community. The application was submitted in January 2021 and has been evaluated by ICOMOS over the following month. Due to the Ukraine war, the committee meeting of UNESCO World Heritage Committee, which should have taken place last summer in Russia, was postponed. It is now determined for September this year in Saudi Arabia. And of course, we hope that the committee will come to a positive decision about Erfurt. But now to our main subject today, which is of no direct relevance for the decision, because after the excavation, a house was built above the excavation site and nothing remained of the excavated structures. The bridge you can see on the picture was built around 1900, and a number of buildings had to be destroyed for it. When in 2007 we found this large circular structure, I simply didn't have a clue how to interpret it. Let's have, but before we go into the details of the excavation, let's have a look at first at the information we started with, and then at the excavation. It was clear from the beginning that we would find the remains of at least two houses at the former Judengasse, now Hefengasse. From a courtyard, the so-called Mühlenhof, a footbridge led to the other side of the river. Remains of the mill on the other side of the courtyard were found during the refurbishment of the bridge sometime later. The first view of the excavation site already shows many traces of fire, not so unusual since we know of many fires in the city. Right from the beginning of the excavation, a big round structure became visible, very close to the modern surface. A bit above it on the picture, you can also see a well filled up with charcoal. You can see it here a bit better. When we look at the details here, you can see that inside the circular wall, there was a much thinner, almost square wall on the pictures on top and on the left at the bottom, maybe a substructure to stabilize the big oven. The technique of the wall dates to the 12th or early 13th century. The detail on top clearly shows the technique again, and on the other picture you can see that there were layers of burnt clay also underneath this construction, so there may have been even older ovens that were not preserved. The drawing shows the construction even clearer. It is possible that the partly preserved thick wall in the middle here is just a small part of an older oven. The size of the oven is remarkable. It has a diameter of almost 7 meters. In the same year, we excavated a site where the written sources mention a bakery since 1294. In this case, the several ovens were not so well preserved. You can see the layers of burnt clay, but not the walls of the ovens themselves. Also in 2007, at the crossing of two streets, also very close to the surface, a construction was uncovered that looked very much like the oven I just showed you at Hafengasse. It was just a bit smaller, but the technique was the same, and here too we found big layers of burnt clay and coal. The map shows our 3 archaeological examples, but also bakeries I could find in the written sources between 1569 and 1848. It is difficult to go back further in time because the text lists that are our only sources are just difficult, make it difficult to locate the individual plots of land. But the maps shows that in these centuries, between the 16th and 19th century, the majority of the bakeries remained in place. They never moved. At the moment, we can say that at least 8 of them, you can see them here, were already there from the 13th century onwards. But the city's archive is working on the text list, and I'm sure the continuity will be shown for others as well. Let's go back to the first excavation. This drawing shows the situation in the late 18th century, the merchant's bridge with the houses on it, and on both ends mills and churches, and also the small footbridge crossing the river. Here. And we are on this side of the river. Just a short time before it was destroyed, the mill near the bakery here at the end of the 19th century, before the Rathausbrücke that I've showed you on the picture was built. You have seen these maps before, but now I want to go into details. For 1293, Barbara Perlich and Michael Lemmerhirt, who both worked on these text lists, actually found a bakery, but the owner was Christian. You can see it from the red color of the names. Before the pogrom of 1349, the bakery remained in place, but the owner is uncertain. And it is only in 1407 it is clear that there was a Jewish bakery, although the text lists never mention a Jewish baker. The Liber Judaeorum, the text list for the second Jewish community, mentions the bakery only indirectly. It says that the houses of Simon of Cologne were opposite the Jewish bakery. And Barbara and Maike managed to locate these houses on this side of the street. When we compare the situation in other cities, we start with one of the archaeologically best examined, Lübeck, with also an excellent situation of the preservation of historical sources. It is possible to show the places of the bakeries in 1378. They all lie at the crossroads, very similar to the situation in Erfurt. And the few archaeological examples, you can see the yellow stars, showed that they were all lying in the backyard of the properties. The form of the ovens is round, but typically for northern Germany, built of bricks. And you can see that there were 7 ovens beginning from the 14th century to the 18th century. Here you have, it's even longer, it goes to until the 20th century. And Mengstraße with a bit extraordinary form, and only from the 15th to the 16th century. Another example from northern Germany in Wismar, although rather small, shows the rather well-preserved dome of an oven of the 14th century. This is our example from Rostock, gives a closer look at the inner construction with a layer of stones under the clay platform. The dome is not preserved. We are now going to the south with Freiburg. Here, the round constructions were built with cobblestones, and the different ovens date between the 12th and the 16th century. I also want to show you an unpublished example from Regensburg, close to the Danube, in a quarter with many traces of different workshops. Again, you can see many traces of fire and a construction which is rather square than round, here in the drawing. My last examples, and these examples were all that I could find in Germany, is from a castle in Thuringia again. In the outer area of the castle, an oven was excavated with a diameter of almost 4 meters. Christian Tannhäuser, who published it, interprets it as the oven that was erected for the builders of the castle. Later on, there were only a few men left in this castle, so much less bread was needed, and a smaller oven was built on top of the older one with a diameter of only 2 meters. When we compare all the archaeological examples, you can see that our oven from Erfurt is by far the biggest. Of course, we can't prove that this early oven is a community oven. We simply lack the written sources for this time, but it is possible nonetheless. I guess I don't have to explain for the audience today the special needs of a Jewish community for matzot, or the necessity to keep food warm on Shabbat. I also tried to collect all the information we have for the Middle Ages. Apart from these wonderful illuminated manuscripts, I did not find an abundant number of written sources. I have just finished an article that goes into detail. Here today, I will just summarize. We know of one Jewish bakery in Würzburg in the 14th century that produced bread also for Christians. We have sources for Mainz and Speyer for community ovens, and we also have discussions of the rabbis if it is allowed to eat bread baked by Christian bakers. As in other fields, this changed during the course of time, and of course, every rabbi decided in the end for his own community. Let's have a look at least 2 other manuscripts which show the baking of the matzot. To summarize my lecture, I can just say that of course, I can't prove that we have actually found an early Jewish professional bakery, but looking at the continuity of the site as a bakery and with the changing of the ownership, it is still possible. Now, I want to thank you for listening. And of course, you are very welcome to ask questions or add comments.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, Karin. And yes, we do have a few questions. I will read them now, and also I would like to encourage our audience to write more. And also, if some of you is more comfortable with asking a question, so please let me know, and I will open your mic. Okay, so the first question from Jenny at the beginning of your presentation is, what was the population of the second medieval Jewish community in Erfurt? Do we know the numbers, more or less?
It's always difficult with numbers. We can't say, we can't give exact numbers of the city's inhabitants as a whole. And with the Jewish communities, even, well, the problem is that we have the tax lists, but not everybody had to pay taxes. People had to pay taxes for their plots of land, their houses. So it's just the owner of the house, the head of the family, who paid the taxes. And you can't calculate the number of the families, the people who worked for this family, etc. So it's always the factor that we don't know, by which we have to multiply the number from the tax list. We only have 1 year at the end of the 14th century when all the members of the Jewish community, I think over the age of 10 were counted, or even a bit older. And there we have 100 members of the community.
Okay, thank you. Actually, another question from Tami from Tel Aviv. She just wrote now, did you find any writings by medieval Jewish families in Erfurt? For example, diaries or journals? I don't think so, because this is still before Gutenberg, I guess. But yeah, any sort of writings or memoirs?
We would have loved to find them, but no. We have the community's manuscripts, which are a big treasure as well. I just showed this one picture. This would be every one of them, and there are 15, are worth their own lectures. And it's not my field of studies, of course, but there were no personal manuscripts or writings or poems or whatever. Sorry.
No, that's fine. we are just asking. Yeah, we are just asking. Okay, another question I think you answered, but still, just to be sure, do we know about survivors from the pogrom of 1349, or do we have information whenever there was the entire Jewish community which perished, or there were some people who maybe flew and escaped and maybe later even came back?
Well, I told you that there was a study about the pogrom of 1349, and it could be proven that it was so well planned by a group of people, even members of the city's council, and they blocked the way out of the city. So we don't know any names of people from the first community that appear in the second community. That's one hint. And the situation with the treasure shows that people did not come back. The treasure was found because the owner was killed, and he was not able to tell anybody about the hidden treasure, of course.
Yes, yes, of course. Okay, thank you. Another question from Nikki Halpern. When you are saying, during your lecture, you're saying a few times the word the council built housing or rebuild a synagogue. Do you mean the city council or the Jewish council?
No, the city council.
Ah, so this is very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. This is quite unique, I think, for medieval European towns.
Even the synagogue. Yeah.
Yeah.
The houses is one point, because of course they wanted the Jews to settle in the city. And I think it's due to the good connections through Europe that Erfurt had, because of the trade they had with other cities, especially to Poland, to Silesia. I think that's the reason why people came from this region to Erfurt. It's one of the next biggest town on the Via Regia.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
You know well, I guess.
Yes, actually me know, yes. Okay, another question from Alexandra, actually going to other parts of Europe, more Western and South. She's asking, on your second slide, there was a map with a red trail, for example, like in Burgos, Oviedo, or Santiago de Compostela. Please, may you explain what is the red trail?
That was the Via Regia.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Going from Spain to Ukraine, or even further.
Yes. Okay, Sandra is asking, actually coming now back to your own research as an archaeologist. How did you know the stone house was once a Jewish house? Was there, for example, an evidence of a hall for a mezuzah, or how is the methodology? I guess.
No, it's not. Actually, it's not my field. It's the historians who found out that, as I told you, we have the text list, and we have the text list for the end of the 13th century. And they say, well, I showed it on the map, that we have the owner of this stone house. It's not the stone house, that's our term that we found for it. It just says that this house once was the house of Rieche, the Jewish woman with the name of Rieche. And this text list is from the end of the 13th century, so it is very probable that Rieche has actually built this house, because we have the dendrodates dating to the middle of the 13th century.
Okay.
But we don't have the mezuzah because we simply don't have the doors.
Of course, yeah, no, I guess, but still I had to read the question. So.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so actually, a question which somehow refers to this topic which you were now answering, because Carol Harris is asking, was the Erfurt hoard owned by a single person? Because, for example, the wedding ring looks like it could be a communal ring used by a Jewish brides, especially those who were poorer ones. So I guess Carol also is a specialist.
Well, that's of course Maria's field, but she would tell you that in later times these rings were used by the Jewish community, and given to the bride for the wedding. But in the 14th century, this is different. People were wealthy enough to have their own wedding rings. And the ring is important because that's the amount of money that the bride gets at the wedding. It is important for her because if her husband dies or if she's divorced, she will still keep this ring, and it's important for her future, for her living afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to Tammy, the person who asked before about any writings which you found. So she's continuing the subject, and she's asking, so do we maybe have receipts of cakes and bread from these ancient bakeries, a bakery, and maybe there is someone who is still making them today?
As far as I know, there are bakers who think they are producing medieval goods, but I don't know of any recipes. I looked up sources for bakers because I was also interested into the organization of the Christian bakeries to compare it. And I found many terms for different goods, for different roles. And in most cases, I didn't even understand the names of it. I'm sorry.
No,
and
no,
I don't think it's explained anywhere.
Yeah, we understand. Well, it's quite a long period of time. Okay, Carol, the same person who was just asking about the ring, she also just wrote another question, which also it seems very interesting. Do we have any written decision for this region of Germany about rabbis permitting Jews to buy a Christian from Christian bakers? Because it is possible that a bakery could have remained in Christian hands, but be acceptable for Jewish consumption, even matzot.
Yeah.
So
I think this is very probable. We have the discussion in the Shum cities, and we have it only for a certain time. And we also know that in Spain and in France, Jews were allowed to eat bread that was made by Christian bakers. That was no problem. It were just these very strict regulations in the Shum cities where it is different. We have a rather close connection to the Shum cities in Erfurt because we have the Archbishop of Mainz, who was also responsible or important for Erfurt. He was the head of the city. So the connections were very close, but we don't have any written sources talking about this. It's difficult.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, and another question. You have really a lot of questions today. Deborah is asking, and actually, I guess you will say more because she just said that she believes that there was an evidence gleaned from the cemetery showing the different DNA of Ashkenazi Jews. So this is another topic which you and your colleagues were involved in this bigger research. So maybe you can explain a bit about this DNA research.
Yeah, but that's a long story, actually.
Yes, I know, but we can try to make it in 5 minutes story as well.
Yeah, I make it very short. I told you about the second community and where people came from. And in the end, it was just what the genetic studies found out. We have two groups of people in the cemetery. It is difficult to decide when this cemetery well, to date, the graves in this cemetery, there were just 47 graves that we excavated. And so it's just a very small part of a very big cemetery. And archaeologically, I could not decide were these graves of the first or the second community. We do not know so much about the members of the first community, but we know, I told you that the members of the second community came from Silesia and from other regions. And this is just what the genetic results show. We have this region exactly. And what was even more fascinating was we have families in this cemetery, and another study showed that the parents, they came from these eastern regions, and their children, they grew up in Erfurt. So we seem to have the founded generation of the second community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for all your answers. So many people thank you for this great lecture. One person even wrote beautiful lecture. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to host you. And we hope we'll have another occasion in the future as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Laila Tov.
And thank you everyone for coming and attending. And see you in the future.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.